Okay, I'm going to get started. The sessions that start on time tend to end on time, so we're gonna get going and hope that a few more people trickle in. This is a panel on shared mobility, one of the four that are going on simultaneously during this time slot. We have a great lineup of speakers, and we're going to be exploring issues from the perspective of government agencies, the private sector, as well as the research community in the three talks. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn. They'll work through their times. Then hopefully we'll save plenty of time at the end for conversation. And again, please come close to the front if you can. It's going to make it easier for the audience members. I'm going to start off with some sort of context-setting remarks, and then we will move on to each of our speakers in turn. Joshua Schank from LA Metro. Justin Erlich from Uber, and then Chris Hendrickson from Carnegie Mellon. So let me get started. Are we set? Are we queued up with the? Okay. Where's my presentation? Yeah, well, the moderator has a presentation which was uploaded, and I'll need that presentation. So in all of the breakouts, all of the moderators were asked to give short opening presentations, and those were all uploaded. So what I'll do during this dead time is I will take the time to introduce each of the speakers so we can use the time effectively. Okay, Joshua Schank, who will be the second speaker in the session, he is the Chief Innovation Officer at LA Metro in Los Angeles, where he leads the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. The OEI mandate is to champion new ideas and improve mobility in Los Angeles by piloting and implementing new and experimental programs, including new and unsolicited P3 projects. In this role, Joshua serves as the primary Metro liaison with entrepreneurs, the established private sector representatives, as well as the Academy. He was previously CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation in Washington, D.C., and before that, he's worked on a variety of transportation policy issues in Washington, D.C. for many years. He holds a PhD in urban planning from Columbia. Our second speaker is Justin Erlich from Uber. He is Uber's head of policy for autonomous vehicles and urban aviation. Prior to Uber, he worked for then California Attorney General Kamala Harris, who is now a U.S. Senator, on technology and policy operations. Prior to the AG's office, he spent 5 years with McKinsey & Company working on sustainability as a sustainability strategy consultant. Justin is an attorney by training. He holds a law degree from NYU and clerked on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And finally, our third speaker is Chris Hendrickson from Carnegie Mellon University. He is the Hammerschlag University Professor of Engineering Emeritus and Director of the Traffic 21 Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. He studies transportation engineering, planning, management, including the design for the environment, project management, transportation systems finance, and computer applications. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, which for those of you outside the Academy is a very big deal. And he is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Transportation Engineering. So it's a great lineup of speakers, and I'm anxious to get going on it. So as I mentioned, I'm gonna get started with just some brief remarks, and then we'll turn it over to the speakers. So first, shared mobility at a conference like this, everyone's come in and imagined maybe two people in a car who don't know one another, but this is shared mobility, right? Is this? So this is part of our shared mobility. So what are some of the characteristics? We have people with many different origins and destinations. They're coming together for at least part of their trip. They're sharing the same piece of transportation infrastructure, right? So that seems like a working definition of shared mobility. So how about this? Is this shared mobility? Well, we have many people with different origins and destinations. They're coming together for at least part of their trip, and they are sharing the same piece of transportation infrastructure. So I think that we can see urban transportation systems in some contexts as involving sharing of all sorts, but I think what we're thinking is somewhat more intimate than a bunch of people driving alone together on the same freeway. So what's shared about shared mobility? And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we work forward through these talks. Is it that we share the same right-of-way, the same subways or freeways, that we share the same terminals, an airport terminal or a parking lot? We share the same vehicle. So this could be serially, as we have with UberX, or simultaneously with Lyftline. Does that sharing extend to friends and family? Because when we look out on the highway system, most of the people who are pooling of one sort or another are typically with people they live with, or with strangers. And that's the rub. That's the more complicated issue of sharing. And we're going to talk a bit more about that today. So what are some of the purported benefits of shared mobility? Well, you hear a lot about energy and environmental benefits. We're able to move more people around, so more PMT over VMT, and we're able to get more efficiency out of the system. We're able to do so that consumes less energy, produces fewer emissions. We're also able to make better utilization of limited road capacity by moving more people or possibly goods on the same amount of capacity. And we may be able to provide affordable mobility benefits. That is that many people don't drive because they simply can't afford to. And does the world change when you're able to purchase an auto trip one at a time rather than have to purchase a car to make that sort of trip? So first, some good news. Pooling is a big thing. So in 1980, 20% of all journey-to-work trips were in carpools. And commuting by means other than driving alone, so if we take pooling and we take public transit and other means, it was 36% in 1980, so a big share of the market. Now some not so good news. So it was 20% in 1980. After the rise of the sharing economy and shared mobility, in 2015 we were all the way up to 9%. So we've had a significant drop in pooling activities. Of course, most of that is off the network from Uber and Lyft, and involves people making their own decisions about how to travel about in cars. Commuting by means other than driving alone, so that's public transit as well as carpooling, 36% in 1980, 23% in 2015. And in Southern California, we're doing some work now trying to understand why our significant investments in new public transit services, we built over 100 miles of rail in the last 25 years, is starting to see a dip in patronage, which is concerning to all. So this is just a look at sort of national trends. The green line is the non-solo driver. That's just the data I gave you. The red line is carpool from back to 1980 to 2015. So we don't see an enormous bump up in overall levels of shared travel as a result of the rise of these new TNCs, at least not yet. So does that mean that shared mobility is dying? We should just end this session and go home? It might be, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's a really important thing that we want to try and tackle here is what are the things that we do to influence behavior that might have an effect on sharing? I want to put out there that technology presents an enormous opportunity, but it's unlikely to save the day on its own when it comes to sharing. There are lots of developments on the horizon that point to an increased role of ride sharing, and technology is among them. But shared mobility has faced historically what I would describe as an information problem. So we have, what do I want to do? This is really kind of conceptually thinking about travel behavior. So you have a trip purpose, and out of that generates trips. I want to engage in some activity. Where might I go? What are my opportunities to go through? I map those opportunities out. How might I get there? Then I have knowledge of travel options. I can walk, I can bike, I can drive, I can share a ride with someone. I can take a TNC, I can take public transit. When and where should I travel? And that involves activity sequencing and path analysis. So all of this is a complicated set of decisions which don't directly involve sharing but may. So if we think about the evolution of shared mobility, it's a lot about trying to tackle that information problem. So we can think about hitchhiking. It's really the kind of the first form of shared mobility, and that has really high information costs for both the hitchhiker and the hitchhikee in terms of what What's the issue here? How do we negotiate this? Is this person a safe person to work with? With public transit, we lowered information costs dramatically, but at a substantial cost of flexibility. We're going to have buses operate on a fixed route, on a fixed schedule. We have predetermined fares. A lot of the rules are taken care of, so we don't have to engage in negotiation, but we don't have much flexibility in the service. We have things like street hail taxis, and that reduced the upfront information costs. We know that from livery that people have designated themselves as taxi drivers, but it imposes high prices and uncertainty as well. It also required the development of regulation so that we're going to limit the supply of taxis in some cases. We're going to make sure that drivers are maintaining their vehicles, that they have decent driving records. There's a lot of things that we have to do to solve the information cost problem with street hail taxis. Then we have dispatch taxis, which lowers information costs a bit more. Right? I can call and be assured that I'm going to be picked up in some way, but it required huge upfront costs for drivers. You need to be out there distributed on the network. You need to get radio information about where to go to pick up drivers. You need to identify that person, pick them up, take them to a destination that you may not know until that time. And then finally, TNCs, which dramatically reduced the information costs for both drivers and passengers. And it really is this drop in information costs that has enabled this growth of sharing within this niche. So how does shared mobility complicate this already complicated set of nested decisions? Well, in 1917, 100 years ago, there was essentially no information technology. You know, we had hitchhiking, streetcars, and taxis. In 2017, we have a lot more to choose from, and a potential for modal integration as well. So where do I want to go? Is there anyone else going at that time? When do I want to go? Is anyone else going at the time? Where do I want to go? Is anyone else going there? But what means do I want to go? Is that service available? What route will I travel? Where do I start and end my journey? This all requires a lot of coordination, and it's that coordination that is really sort of the breakthrough, I think, in many ways. So in addition to just that kind of coordination on the network, there's a lot of we heard earlier about trust. There's trust terms and transactions that are really critical as well. So with that coordination, so where will we meet up? How will we do that? Can we communicate with one another? No, I'm on the other corner down here. Look at me, I'm in the green shirt with the hat on. There's negotiation. So if you have ever hitchhiked, you have to agree on terms before you get in the car. Where are you going? How much are you willing to pay? Is this for free? Are you going to help with gas? Can you agree on terms? Those are taken care of. Trust, will the rider and driver be safe sharing the ride? The rise of sort of social media and the ability to have the drivers rate the passengers and the passengers rate the drivers has created an enormous reduction in sort of the information costs associated with safety and knowing who's doing the driving. So then this begs the question is, what exactly are transportation network companies? So a classically described triad of any transportation system is the following. You have vehicles, you have terminals, and you have way. So for air travel, the vehicles are airplanes, the terminals are the airports, and the way is the air traffic controlled skies. Okay, and you can see this for almost any system. So for transportation network company, the vehicles are millions of privately owned autos shifted into commercial service and back into private use. The terminals are parking that already exists. The way are streets and roads that already exist and are used by other travelers. So what is the ownership there? There's no cars, no terminals, no way. What do they own? They don't own the vehicles, they don't own the terminals, they don't own the way, but they do control the information. And it's really that breakthrough in information that I think is key. And the value of these companies is really in their ability to use and aggregate and distribute this information to create a service out of virtually thin air. Okay, I think I've said this. All right, so is there a potential for a shared revival? We have evidence that travelers will trade off transaction costs of sharing with the monetary costs of travel. Only time will tell whether solving the information problem will result in TNCs and other shared ride platforms operating at a scale to turn the tide on decline in shared mobility. There are questions about the scalability of this particular model, but as you can see from many of the discussions we've had, the ambition of many of these companies to scale beyond the current model is substantial. So is there a promise for a more shared mobility future? I would close with this. This is sort of the question we've heard about this morning. Are people really going to give up their cars and share trips with others through automated mobility? Or will they own their autonomous vehicles and keep all of that privacy, keep all their stuff in the trunk, that great sound system, the temperature just the way they like it, the yoga mat tucked away behind the back seat? Or is this the question? That given the modest means of a growing share of people on Earth in both the developed and developing worlds, will people, most of whom have limited economic opportunities, seek to buy their automobility via subscription or a trip at a time, because most of them won't be able to afford to own their own car, autonomous or not? And I think that excitement about technological growth really needs to think about what the mass market is for these services and what the potential might be. So with that, those are my 2 cents in kind of setting this up, and I want to now turn this over to our lineup of august speakers, the first of whom is Joshua Schank from the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. Please welcome Joshua.
Hi. I'm really excited to be able to present at an autonomous vehicles conference because with the title of an office called Office of Extraordinary Innovation and my title of Chief Innovation Officer, the 2 things I get asked most about are autonomous vehicles and Hyperloop. And what I'm about to tell you is how little relevance those things play in my current job. And the reason I want to tell you that at an autonomous vehicles conference is that I'm here to talk about the things that we're actually doing related to shared mobility, which, as Brian just explained, is pretty much everything we do at LA Metro, because what we do is try to get more people out of single occupancy vehicles and into multiple occupancy vehicles, be they buses, light rail, or pooled rides in personal vehicles, van pool, bike share. We do any number of things to get people out of single occupancy driving. And so autonomous vehicles, from our perspective, from a public policy perspective, don't really represent a tremendous amount of promise in that area. And that's why I've titled this 5 Reasons Why We Won't Achieve Level 5 Autonomy Anytime Soon, if ever, because at the end of the day, if you think about the major things that happen in transformation of transportation, they require government, and they require public policy to agree that there's an objective that they care about. And I don't see how level 5 autonomy has fallen into that bucket. And I'll explain why with those 5 reasons. We all know the 5 levels of automation. In this crowd, I'm sure you don't need much explanation, but the critical difference that I am making a distinction about in level 5 is that in level 5, you absolutely don't need the driver at all. He or she is completely out of the system. And that is what people tend to focus on when they think about AVs, not levels 0 through 4, which are actually much more achievable. So here's reason number 1. I come from the aviation industry, and if you may have noticed, there are no autonomous airplanes. Why is that? It's not because they lack the technology. If you have ever landed on a runway and felt it go dum-dum like that, that's the pilot practicing landing the plane. That is not the computer landing the plane. That's why it's a rough landing. The computers are completely capable of flying planes by themselves to and from any destination, but why do we have pilots there? Is it because pilots enjoy flying? Is it because we're trying to preserve jobs? No, it's because people would be terrified of flying in a plane with nobody there in case the computer malfunctions, and computers malfunction all the time. And having a vehicle going at a very high speed and the risk of a computer malfunction is more risk than people are willing to accept. Now, it is true that by and large, the statistics would indicate that AVs are likely to be much safer, even in fully autonomous mode, than a person driving. But the statistics are not relevant. People are terrified of air travel even today, and it's the safest form of transportation on the planet. So it's not a question of whether the statistics are there. The question is whether people will accept it. And I don't know how they're going to accept the fact that a truck is going to fly down the highway at 80 miles per hour without a human being in it. Number 2, technology revolutions do not tend to work this way. I think we are in the sales phase of this revolution. A lot of people are selling a lot of things and potentially making a lot of money off of the revolution, but that's not where government comes in. That's not how public policy works, and a lot of public policy changes are going to be needed for this to actually work. I've put pictures of a few other transportation innovations that have been pitched to me, even now, that have been pitched for years. Monorail, you got the maglev, you got the PRT. Hyperloop. These are all new technologies that never really got anywhere, and Hyperloop was still to be determined, but they never became reality because the actual public policy wasn't behind them. They were just new ideas and new innovations that might improve things here and there, but didn't demonstrate enough of a public policy benefit to actually get off the ground. Reason number 3, Brian touched on this as well. Why aren't people sharing more right now? From an economics perspective, many, many more people should be getting rid of their vehicles and using the TNCs in major urban areas than are currently doing so. And in fact, if you look at what TNCs have done, they are increasing the amount of vehicles on the road, they're increasing VMT, they're increasing pollution, they're increasing a lot of the transportation challenges, but they're not actually getting more people to share rides, as Brian just explained. And if we have bike share, we have got car-to-go in many cities. Sharing is not a natural phenomenon that people were already doing, despite the economics pointing them towards it. And so I don't see how just changing the economics even further by getting rid of the driver is going to change that equation. Reason number 4, and this is the one, a critical one that I was pleased to see was discussed this morning, that the greatest benefit that we could possibly see from automation in vehicles is reducing deaths in vehicles. And vehicular deaths have started to rise again in recent years because of increased number of people traveling. And the only way that we're going to really reduce these vehicle deaths is if we focus public policy on that goal. That's how we got airbags, that's how we got seat belts, that's how we improved, reduced drunk driving. Public policy did those things. That's how that happened. And the technology world is very focused on getting the driver out of there. But if we really want to achieve public benefit and not just pay it lip service, you have to focus on what are the safety benefits of this and how can we get as much as possible. And that does not necessitate level 5. That necessitates trying to move automation forward and putting more and more safety features in vehicles, which we've already been doing for years. And finally, reason number 5, the urban environment is too complex and risky for a level 5 experience. I take the subway every day to work, but I do have to drive because it's LA. I have to drive to get to the subway. And I drive every day on LA streets, and every single day there is a human interaction where I look at someone else's eyes in order to figure out what they're going to do and what I'm going to do. It's just inevitable in the urban environment. I'm looking at people on the street. I'm looking at people at bicycles. I'm looking at people in other cars. Computers can't actually do that. And we're being told that they can. I happen to have the benefit of a father who worked in the artificial intelligence field for 30 years, and he has said that essentially we're at the same place we were in AI in 1982 that we are today, which is that computers still can't do that. And you're being told that they can because people think that this is a technology that is going to transform the world. Maybe it will, but the way it's going to transform the world is primarily by saving people's lives in vehicles. So now that I've gone through that diatribe, which I just had to get off my chest, it's an autonomous vehicles conference, I'm going to tell you what we actually are doing to try to accomplish some of the same public policy goals that I talked about. What we did is in February of last year, we opened up a new unsolicited proposal policy and invited the private sector in to give us their innovative ideas and said, we want to try innovative things, do new experiments, improve what we do for our customers and beyond. Any company can submit a proposal, and it forces us to consider whether that's something we want to do. So we've received 81 unsolicited proposals in that time. I will note that not a single one of them was for an autonomous vehicle. We did receive one unsolicited from Mobileye for an autonomous component for our buses, but it was not in any way near getting drivers out of the vehicles, even though that's something that we'd be very excited to test if it were actually available. These are where all the proposals are. Most of them are, as you can see, still just being accepted, but we're moving forward on a lot of them, and we're getting to implementation on a number of them. This is a general breakdown of the types of unsolicited proposals we've received. You can see that a lot of them are in the tech space. Those tech mobility services tend to be around the idea of shared mobility in particular, and I'll talk through what a few of those are. So we've received 81 proposals, reviewed 77 of them. We're actually now up to 86. This is, we get them so quickly, this is out of date already. And we've critically engaged internal experts on all of these subjects. So when an unsolicited comes in, it's not me, it's not my staff looking at it and saying, we think this is good or we think this is bad. It's bringing departments together from across the agency with various levels of expertise to figure out how this fits into into what they're trying to do. So out of this has come 3 mega projects for shared mobility based on unsolicited proposals. Well, now, what does that mean? That means that these 3 projects, because of unsolicited proposals, have caused us to alter our path. We were planning on building all 3 of these with the sales tax revenue we got from Measure M. So if you're not familiar with Los Angeles, in November last year, 71% of people in LA County voted to give us a half-cent sales tax indefinitely to build out the transportation system in Los Angeles. That's $120 billion we're going to be spending over the next 40 years to build shared mobility, namely in rail and BRT, but also with express lanes on freeways. These 3 projects, the private sector had a different idea about how to deliver them using private financing components that allow us to accelerate the project delivery. The West Santa Ana branch is going to be a competitive P3 project. Another, Sepulveda Pass, is going to be a project development agreement where we bring the private sector in early to help formulate what that project actually is. So they're going to come in before the environmental process even begins. And then our strategic managed lanes network, where the private sector had an idea for how we could build it in 10 years instead of 40 years without costing us any more money. So all 3 of these things were great ideas that we never would have gotten without the unsolicited proposal process, and are going to accelerate major rail lines and express lane networks that are going to carry millions of people much faster than we would have expected. Now, I'm not saying that autonomous vehicles aren't important, but compared to this that we know we can do faster, and that private sector innovation is helping us accelerate, autonomous vehicles don't seem to offer as much promise. Mobile tolling is an experiment we're about to undertake. We have express lanes that allow people to bypass traffic if they're in single occupancy vehicles, or to bypass traffic in carpools. So you can do that for free if you're in a HOV 2+. We're going to have to change that to 3 or 4. But for now, shared mobility is being encouraged by our toll system. However, one of the barriers is that you need to have a transponder in your car, and we have to put up physical gantries whenever we have a toll. Well, if we can use phones as the gantry, and if we can use phones as the transponder and virtual gantries, then we can expand our tolling capacity and our toll system much faster, and we can have a much better and more customer-friendly service to offer. So we're testing this as a result of an unsolicited proposal. Real-time customer information. Brian was just talking about the critical role of information in connecting people to vehicles. We do a terrible job of connecting people to vehicles because most of the time you're standing by a sign on the side of the road hoping a bus shows up. Now we can provide much better customer information in the form of bus arrival predictions. However, our current bus arrival prediction algorithm has not been working very well for a number of reasons, one of which is that we don't know where our buses are. Somebody came in with an idea for us to know where our buses are and predict their arrival time much more effectively, and to be able to give that information to customers. That's a critical service that we can provide that will improve shared mobility by getting more people on our buses, because they'll have greater certainty about when they might show up. Smart bike racks. We're also in the business of trying to help people access our stations. As I referred to earlier, in Los Angeles, even when we build out our entire rail network, it's still going to be a long distance to get to and from most of our stations for most people, because it's in a very large, sprawling metropolis. I'm 4 miles from the nearest subway station, so I have to drive there. Well, a lot of people like to bike there. It's great weather in Los Angeles. Some of it's flat. So one of the problems with biking to the station is there's nowhere to put your bike. We do have bike lockers, but they're cumbersome. You have to rent one in advance. You have to have a key, whatever. This is very easy. You roll the bike up. You use your tap card, which is the same card you use to get on our metro system, and you lock your bike, and then you leave. Very easy, very simple. Just a new technology idea that can potentially get more people on transit very quickly and very easily. Here's another one that came through. We have the most used BRT line in the country, the Orange Line, which runs completely on its own right-of-way, which I'd love to test an autonomous vehicle on if I possibly could, but I haven't gotten a proposal for that. What I did get a proposal for is, can we give the drivers better information? Because currently, the drivers don't know when the lights ahead of them are going to turn green, even though they're timed to turn green for them. So if we tell them, well, drive at this speed and you'll hit the next 5 lights, that's really useful information. And we know what that speed is because we have sensors in every single intersection. So just giving them that information by putting something on the dashboard will improve the flow of the Orange Line, make it more comfortable for drivers and passengers alike. So these are simple but useful ideas that improve shared mobility that have come through our unsolicited proposal process. And then finally, we're partnering with a transportation network company. I have in there TNC to be named later because we're about to announce who it is later this week, and I can't tell you who it is yet. But there is a transportation network company that is going to work with us under a grant from FTA, Federal Transit Administration, to demonstrate the value of increasing access to TNCs to everybody. Because right now, TNCs are restricted. Not all members of the population actually have equal access to them, right? If you're disabled, if you don't have a smartphone, if you're low income and can't afford it, or if you don't have a bank account, all those groups face challenges in getting a TNC. Those are our core customers. So trying to help them use a TNC to get to and from our stations, again, a challenge that we have throughout Los Angeles County, is really a useful thing to test. We're going to take 3 stations, we're going to draw a 3-mile perimeter around them, and let people use TNCs to get to and from those stations and see if that improves shared mobility, getting more people on our rail and bus system. So I just want to sum up by saying this is an exciting time to be part of transportation. It is transforming, and AVs are part of that transformation. But from a public policy perspective, it is our role to think about the public outcomes that we care about. What we heard a lot of this morning, which was difficult for me to listen to, was what the private sector would like to see as outcomes from the new technology. But the public sector ultimately has to make that determination. We are not living under corporate overlords just quite yet. I'd like to postpone that for a long time, because what we actually have to do is figure out what are the public policy goals we want to achieve as a society, and then use those to shape autonomous technology to meeting those outcomes, not the other way around. Thank you very much.
Great. Hi, I'm Justin Erlich from Uber, lead our head of policy for autonomous vehicles, and I guess I'm probably now here to give a slightly more positive view on AVs. Although I think we share some interests, particularly around moving away from vehicle ownership and single occupancy vehicles. So one thing I've noticed in all the morning sessions and a lot of these things, we all love the same stats. So I will show you the same stats that you've seen before, but with new pictures maybe. So there's lots of cars in the world, billions of them. And as we all know, they don't actually get used all that much, and that's because we really have sort of peaky demand for them. And when they're used, most of the seats sit empty, so 95% idle, one person using all those, one seat in each car. You've got lots of empty seats, either not moving or not utilized. And I think this is probably not coming as a great surprise to anyone, not great for road congestion, our wallets, or the environment. And it doesn't seem to be getting necessarily, unless there's some notable changes, much better, because as GDP rises in countries, the level of car ownership also goes up, and so we've got a lot more people potentially buying cars in the future. So Uber's perspective is that it doesn't have to be that way. And in this way, I think we are very focused on thinking about what it would take to move people away from single occupancy vehicle and car ownership. I think the first thing that we started with, and I think this is sort of an arc, there are multiple steps in this, which is right now, I think a lot of people have the car because it's convenient, they can rely on a price that's reliable. But what if we didn't have the need to rely on that all the time? What if there was another way to travel in addition to public transit, which I'm a huge fan of, by the way, just so you know, that didn't require you getting your own car and you could rely with a push of a button that you could get a car to drive you where you need to be, whether it's direct or solving the infamous first and last mile problem. So that's what we worked on first. And this is a map of sort of where we got to in New York. New York had a huge problem, particularly with the outer boroughs, with taxis, and the green medallion system, for anyone who follows that, was actually a big innovation. But we now find a lot of our demand coming from outer boroughs who previously weren't that well served by taxis, and they have got huge demand, and we've now started growing the traditional rideshare business. Quite large. And I think Brian mentioned this, there are like multiple forms of rideshare, which is increasing utilization of a vehicle, and then also increasing the utilization of seats in that vehicle. And so UberX was primarily focused, first and foremost, on driving the increase of the utilization of vehicles. And that in itself was a big step. I think there was open questions what it would take to get in a stranger's car without this trust issue that Brian mentioned. And so that was sort of step one, is how do we get people to trust getting in a stranger's car and knowing that they don't need to rely on their own car if they want to move a vehicle. There's a push of a button that will get us there. Step two is a step that we've all talked about a bunch in this session already, which is how do you start sharing and pooling those rides? So getting more utilizations of the seats in the car. The beauty of when you start creating a platform where you have a lot of requested rides, or you can start to see patterns and ability to pair. And as you know, a stat that we often also point is that carpooling peaked in the 1980s. And it hasn't, it's been going down, not up. So can we use this technology to increase carpooling so we're increasing the utilization of the seats? And so what this map shows is a simulation of, on the left-hand side, as if all of our cars were moving single occupancy, and the traffic intensity on the right is when we pool them. And what we're finding is there is a demand and interest for a pooling product. We're in all the cities that we're in, I think 20% of our rides, our Uber pool is in select cities, but in those cities, 20% of the rides are Uber pool rides. And at peak times, in San Francisco, it's upwards of 50%. Now, I think part of what we're working on here is we need to continue to increase the density of the requests. And so I think our hope is that we will continue to grow this in a way that Brian's chart does actually look to start moving up. And I'll talk a little bit more about what else I think it might require to do that. But I think we're really excited about the pool product. And we actually just recently in pilot cities released an update to this product, which is right now, what we're hearing from riders is they still value convenience and price. But we've improved and tweaked the product so if you walk a block or 2 blocks, you can actually get a faster ride at a lower price because it allows us to optimize our algorithms and the traffic flow a little bit better. And so what we're continuing to trying to do is figure out how can we improve the pool product so that you can get where you're going faster at a lower cost to increase demand. That's called Express Pool, and it should be launching in more cities soon. The third is how do we bring down the cost and improve the safety of those vehicles? And so, as was just discussed, I think, by Josh, one of the things that we are really excited about with autonomous vehicles is the safety improvements. And we think there is going to be huge value in reducing the number of fatalities and crashes. And we also think that autonomous vehicles will help bring down the cost of the transit, which will then enable higher demand and increase more of the shared rides as a portfolio of our total number of rides. To that end, we currently have test sites in Phoenix and Pittsburgh, where now, as I think for those of you who may have been here in the morning may have heard, with a push of a button, you can get an autonomous vehicle in Phoenix or Pittsburgh as a ride. We still have safety drivers in the vehicles, but we continue to test and learn and advance that technology. And we also have development sites in San Francisco and Toronto as well, where we continue to refine the technology. Now, I think now bears sort of pausing in a moment of, we have this world where AVs may be really advancing and coming soon to a theater near you. But that world could look pretty different. There's a discussion of if the KPMG talk around car ownership. Will there be a fleet model? How will this look? And we could see, I think people have referred to this, there's like a heaven scenario and a hell scenario. We could imagine a world where people all had the same autonomous vehicles, and then they were sending the cars home when they got dropped off, or circling around for parking while they were off, going to a store or whatnot. And so it is not inherently clear that just deploying AVs will be a panacea. There will be improved safety benefits, but we do have to be very thoughtful about what it looks like to deploy a new fleet. The Uber's vision and what we're excited about is what this conference is all excited about, or at least focused on, I should say, which is a shared automated electric world. We do really think that as we move to an autonomous fleet, the ability to pool more trips will be possible, both by increasing the density of demand, the vehicles on the road, and lowering the costs. We are already, as I said, with a pool product in many cities, and we're continuing to expand that. The automated world. So we're already over at 1 million miles of testing. We've got over 30,000 actual riders who have participated in one of these. We've built our 200th AV vehicle, which our main production area is in Pittsburgh, where we are working very closely with the city there, and then bring them to Phoenix as well. And we've got over 1,000 employees focusing on self-driving. And then also, I think the big push is going to be around electric. We've got pilots, I should say, in many cities where we're experimenting with how to deploy either Uber Green or Uber One, which has Tesla products. We're doing collaborations with ChargePoint and other ways to increase the EV infrastructure. And the reason that we think this is important is because all of these shared electric and automated are all self-reinforcing. So as we increase the utilization rate of these vehicles, the sort of operating mile basis, the economics makes EVs a lot more sensible. We sort of move away from gas, and we're using electric, and so we think that will actually turn the economic incentives and make that a natural choice. And as we then bring down the cost of operating the vehicle even further through AV and EV, that will become more affordable, and that will then drive the sharing and the pooled product. So here's why we're excited about the shared autonomous electric fleet. Improved safety, which we've already talked about, lowering the travel costs. We do think that an shared autonomous electric fleet will increase the transportation access to the disabled, to the elderly. I think there was a whole aging population, which the KPMG talked about this morning, 500 billion miles of people who, if they could get more access. We think that with shared, we can really reduce congestion, both on the technology itself. The AV can be a more consistent driver, but also as we increase the utilization of vehicles, we can reduce the number of cars and thereby reduce congestion. I think there's a higher productivity gain that we can get, both from less time spent in traffic and also being able to work or read or talk to your family while you're in a vehicle. I think there's less environmental harm that will be done, particularly with the EV piece. And I think really a big exciting part of all of this is if we start moving to a world where we don't really need to rely on parking and we can rely on shared fleets, we can start taking back so much of the space that was given over to parking and redevelop it for other higher uses, be it housing to reduce the housing crunch in some of our most dense cities or mini parks. And so I think all of those together is a conversation that we're pretty excited about. I do think that there is an open question, though, and this goes back to something I'd love to talk maybe with the group on the Q&A, is how do we make sure that the shared rides really goes up? This is just, by the way, a slide of urban designers starting to think about building for the future and in a world where we may not need as much parking. And I guess a thing that I find that we're struggling with in cities a bit is part of what's going on is how we think about pricing of the roads and parking will determine a lot on where people choose to drive, park their own car, get a ride share. And I think it's actually really exciting to hear about the pilot that's being done in LA. But I think these are the sorts of policies that will start to also influence whether people have the incentive to do shared rides. And so that could look like congestion pricing, which was done in London. That could look like an urban HOV lane. How we think about pricing the curb, I think, will be a big deal. Right now, some of the biggest reasons that we hear about why people choose to take a ride with Uber is that actually parking takes so long to find or that it's very expensive. So I think we shouldn't think about AVs in a vacuum in terms of a lot of the other policies that are happening in the city, and so that we need to think about all these moving together to make sure that we get to the more heaven version rather than the hell version. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So you're getting the research perspective last out of this group, and so we'll have some interesting contrasts and complements, I think, as I go through this talk. It's nice to come down to Florida. I can already tell you that in Pittsburgh we've already seen snowflakes in the air over the weekend, and so it's nice to be in warm weather for a moment. I'm going to try and set a little context for transformational transportation technologies, and then give a few examples of kind of new technology coming into play in shared ride research, some of which I participated in, some of which I'm borrowing from colleagues at Carnegie Mellon. And I can tell you this is the most exciting time to be a transportation professional over my 30-year career of kind of paying attention to transportation, because there are all these waves of transformational technologies coming into the transportation world simultaneously. There's a whole series of alternative fuels. There's energy efficiencies associated with vehicle operations. There's sensing and automation that's being applied both to infrastructure and to vehicles. There's a whole series of new communication modes. There's some dispute over which technology will win out in the long run, but there's no question that there's more connectivity coming into transportation. And data analytics is something that is affecting not only transportation network companies, but also things like Google Maps is an example of data analytics that really makes a difference in how transportation performs. So there are all these new technologies that provide new opportunities for us. That's the good news. The bad news is we still have all the challenges that we normally have to try and handle transportation. We want to provide mobility services to the economy and society. We want to reduce costs, including congestion, reduce energy use, reduce emissions, particularly in center cities that tend to have poor air quality. Support economic growth, improve safety and resiliency, provide sustainable funding. So we have all these challenges kind of on the management and public policy side. And our challenge, I think, right now is trying to take advantage of these technological opportunities and try and help address some of these challenges. And I'll just spend a couple of slides talking about a few of them. First one is the federal fuel tax revenue for different vehicles. I arbitrarily chose 3 different vehicles to graph here. On the left is a 2012 Ford F-150 pickup truck. The next one over is a 2018 Ford F-150 pickup truck. The next 2 are Priuses for 2012 and 2018. And the far right that doesn't have any graph at all is the Tesla that runs off the power grid. And a couple of observations about this is, first, the number of cents per mile that the federal government is collecting is really low. It's less than 1.5 cents for all these different vehicles. It hasn't been raised in decades, and as a result, the Federal Highway Trust Fund is simply running out of money. The second thing I'd observe is that there's a huge equity issue associated with driving different kinds of vehicles with our reliance on motor fuel taxes. And that's true for both the federal tax and for the state taxes. And that's something that going forward we're probably going to have to address. Second thing that's already been mentioned is that road fatalities are going up after a long period in which we've been able to reduce them. This is US road fatalities per billion VMT, and you can see the tick up in the last couple of years. We're now coming around towards 35 to 40,000 road fatalities each year in the United States. There's a lot more overseas. That's one plane crash every 3 or 4 days. If there was one plane crash every 3 or 4 days, you'd be hearing all sorts of outcry about the carnage that's occurring in our air transport fleet. Well, that's occurring in our roadway fleet right now. I mentioned about how there's this wave of new technologies coming in. On-demand ride sharing is interesting because it's with us now. I mean, we can really see it happening out there, and some of the automation and connectivity is going to be coming on in the next few decades. We're trying to address that in our research program. Our Traffic 21 Institute is a mechanism for doing that. I'm director of Traffic 21. It's housed in our Hines School, but it's interdisciplinary. We have more faculty out of computer science than any other academic unit on campus supported by our centers. We manage Traffic 21 jointly with 2 university transportation centers, Technologies for Safe and Efficient Transportation and Mobility 21, our Smart Mobility Center. We're also trying to extend the same ideas about partnering with corporations and partnering with government agencies, deploying technology, applying new technology for transportation, and we're trying to extend that to all urban systems, and that's our Metro 21 initiative. Interesting thing about our portfolio is that we're both doing some applied research, which I'm going to talk about and feature in this presentation, but we're also still trying to push the boundaries of fundamental research. For example, there's a group that's working on new technology for headlights using an array of LEDs, and I think that's promising for not right away, but down the future. In another realm, we've got a whole group that's working on software verification, which is going to be important for automated vehicles. We also have a group that's associated with the Search Center working on cybersecurity. So those are all fundamental challenges that still continue out there, in addition to the kind of applied work that we're doing. And just like Uber was talking about, we're really interested in the synergies that might exist between these different types of technologies, the data analytics, the alternative fuels, and operational sorts of changes that might occur. And one thing, we finally got enough of a empirical set of observations for the transportation network companies that you can start to empirically test a lot of the assertions about what's going on with energy and emissions. So I'm going to give you a quick outline of one initial step in trying to do that sort of empirical testing. And do Uber and Lyft change personal vehicle ownership, use, and air pollution? And this was an econometric approach using publicly available data from the DOT, the EPA, and Uber and Lyft. And essentially the variable that we were interested in is what happened after Uber and Lyft entered a market in a state to emissions and vehicle ownership and that sort of thing. The regression model we came up with was tried to correct for confounding factors such as population, economic upturns and downturns, that type of thing. And I should emphasize that it's limited to the sorts of publicly available data that's really out there right now. Well, by the way, this is a paper that will be presented at TRB and is out for review for a journal publication right at the moment. So, what are the results? Uber entry is, Uber and Lyft, that's wrong on the slide. Uber entry is associated with changes in vehicle ownership, use, and pollution. And the good news is they're all down. Okay, so vehicle ownership goes down, emissions goes down, and energy use goes down. VMT is up there in gray, not statistically significant in this regression model. And of course, that's something that we'll be watching over time. Things like Uber Pool that you were talking about may have an impact on that as we go forward. So this is really good news. It's an empirical validation, and I think there are other groups that are doing the same sorts of work at this point. We're also doing a lot of work with bike share. We think electric bicycle technologies is going to be something that really makes a difference in terms of bike use. Our bike share is a sort of facility that looks like that. We're looking forward to a time where we go to bikes that just get locked up and don't have to have an infrastructure associated with them. Again, we think that these technologies are going to reduce emissions, reduce VMT for internal combustion engine vehicles, and have a positive impact on urban spaces. We're also working with smart mobility solutions. We did the same sort of thing that Joshua was talking about. We went out with an RFP to our local people and said, what are you interested? What are the problems that you have? Are there things that we can apply technology to? We just went out with grants for 8 different projects. The interesting things, none of them were autonomous vehicles. They were all things like parking, ride-sharing apps, and that kind of thing to try and do things. We're also continuing to work with Pittsburgh in looking at how they're trying to do smart mobility, not only in the downtown area, but up smart spines radiating out of the downtown. I wanted to do one other kind of empirical analysis to give you a feel for how these transformational technologies are affecting things. And it's something that gets asserted quite often, but we actually found some empirical data to try and test that. And we came to the conclusion, and I'll give you an outline of why, early automation saves lives and saves money. And this, of course, is true for both shared mobility vehicles and also privately owned vehicles. And this is work that I did with my doctoral student, Corey Harper, and my colleague, Costa Samaras. And what we did, we got a hold of observed insurance data from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety that kept track of the crash frequency and crash severity for vehicles equipped with the first generation of warning systems and vehicles that were not equipped with the first generation of warning systems. And I emphasize that first generation. These were not sophisticated sorts of warning systems. Then we used typical information about the numbers of crashes and fatal and non-fatal crashes from the federal government. The observed crash frequency reduction is small in these first generation vehicles. It's less than 2%. The first time we did this study and the published paper, it was 1.2. I've had a student go back and look at the data that came out since that time, and it's up to 1.3% reduction in crash frequency. The good news is that we expect that frequency to keep going down, that we keep seeing improvements in the performance of these vehicles, particularly as the warning devices improve and start taking on active features. For example, I'm really interested in getting data on how the active forward crash collision braking systems affect crash frequencies. Now, anytime you have these sorts of new technologies that come on, you get some rebound effects. When seatbelts came in, when airbags came in, people drove more recklessly. We drive faster now than we did without seatbelts, without airbags, and that's because we're more comfortable about the ability of vehicles to protect us. So you see some more reckless driving, less attention to driving when you come in with any of these systems, but fortunately it's usually not a 100% rebound. And the three systems that came in as first generation: blind spot monitoring, lane departure warning, forward collision warning, and they constitute about 25% of all crashes. And even though they're only 25%, it's still a fair number of fatal crashes that are affected by these three things. Now, by the way, the fatal crashes really vary from place to place. It's the mid part of the country that has the highest fatality rates. So this is our setup for the benefit cost analysis. Benefits are the small reduction in crash frequency. Costs are the costs of putting on these warning systems. The good thing is that when we did this study, Toyota came up with a cheap set of warning systems, $600, so that's the cost that we used for doing our analysis. And it turns out that the net benefit is positive. So even a small reduction in crash frequency, because crashes are so expensive, they're larger than the annualized cost of putting on these warning systems. So there's a case for kind of accelerating the introduction of these warning systems, partial automation, into the entire vehicle fleet. By the way, if we could ever make them 100% effective, rather than just 1%, you'd suddenly see major benefits, $200 billion a year sorts of benefits. And so we, as a society, are already starting to see some benefits from automation being introduced into vehicles in the form of crash reductions. By the way, I just mentioned, if I have 2 more minutes, the transformational technology I've been talking about have been decades in development. The big granddaddy and tidal wave that's really influenced things is Moore's Law, the fact that you can put in a lot more transistors, a lot more circuits into each little square inch of silicon. And this is kind of a logarithmic scale going up, and a time series going from about 1972 across the back. And you can see we just improved how much we can put into a chip, and that's led to all these capabilities for data analytics and sensing and automation. I've seen that at Carnegie Mellon. A couple of years ago, we celebrated 30 years of research for automated vehicles. The first vehicle looked like one of the tables up here called Terragator. It was initially designed to do reconnaissance in 3 Mile Island. There were spares that didn't go into 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor, and so they formed the basis of the first automated vehicle research. The van was the next one. It was big. It could, the Terragator, by the way, only went slower than you could walk. The NavLab was a little bit faster. The Jeep is still in use. Boss from 2007 won the DARPA Urban Challenge. 2014 is the Cadillac, which my colleague Raj Kumar developed, and it's embedded the sensors all into the car itself. So, summary, we're progressing fairly rapidly on technology, but we've got differential rates going on. Transportation network companies are something that's happening right now. Automation, connectivity is going to be introduced over time. It's still a debate on how much connectivity and automation are going to be integrated. Incremental automation, I think, is here. We're seeing it as motor vehicle manufacturers sell cars. And so we may do a jump to driverless technology, but I see a long period of incremental automation. Benefits are already accruing for partial automation, and we as transportation professionals really need to try and push our public policy so that we can take advantage of the sorts of opportunities that are now with us. That's my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the three speakers. We now have time for Q&A. My desperate efforts to get you to all move up to the front met with, I think, pretty close to failure, which means that we have to use the mics instead of being able to talk. But if any of you have questions, please either raise your hand or come forward for our panelists. While I'm waiting, oh, okay, I've got one right back here. Why don't you come on up and use the mic?
Yeah, my question is for Joshua. And Joshua, I'm Kevin Salzer. I'm the Transportation Innovation Officer at the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. And so my question for you is, you talked about AVs, and I appreciate the kind of realist view of the technology. And I wanted to ask you, at what point or what would you be looking for, or LA Metro, in the AV industry where LA Metro would be interested in using AVs for transit?
Well, we are primarily a bus agency, so most of our vehicles are buses, and they are driven by professional drivers, and those professional drivers can use any help they can get in terms of automation that will enable them to act more like ambassadors for the company and for the transit system than as operators of the vehicle, and that's where I see the value of autonomous technology. I would start with places like our orange and silver lines, where we have pretty much dedicated right-of-way for those buses, and those are logical places to have the driver play a different role than they play today, where they're still there, and they're still there to make sure things work well and that everybody's safe, but they're also a welcoming agent for the agency and providing better customer service as a result.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yes. Yep.
I was intrigued by all of this, the remarks about my friend Joshua, who I've known from many lives, Joshua. Raised some very interesting questions and challenges, but I think there is actually the answer to your question about what the future role of autonomous vehicles, or maybe a difference of opinion with you about what they could be in solving your mobility problems in Los Angeles, also potentially tends to answer Justin's question that he raised about Uber's biggest challenge here is to, was it Uber, right? is to how can we really get more people to use our pooled service? Think 25 years from now. And I understand your time frame, Joshua, is much shorter, but 25 years from now, most people are not going to own cars. Because as emerging autonomous vehicles come online, the model is probably going to be a confluence of the mobility as a service in combination with autonomous vehicles, driverless vehicles, where I don't need to buy a car anymore. So let's just say 75% of the people don't own cars. When you have that much demand, and it won't just be Uber, it'll be 15 competitors and so forth in urban areas that are offering similar services, you now will have, and everybody's pushing their button, you know, their cell phone button for the application and saying, okay, well, I want to go to here. You now will have about 100 times more market demand for trips at the same time. One company may not, but collectively, especially if you can figure out a way to share information, will not. The mobility providers will begin to call the shots, and they will, in the competitive forces that they will have, those mobility providers will then begin to offer multi-tiered services that are price differential, such as, well, if you want to drive alone, this is how long it'll be. We pick you up, and it'll be this much to get to your destination. But if you're willing to pool, and I think you already do this, you know, you'll have this much of a savings. But probably 3 or 4 more tiers, including maybe 10 passenger shuttles that'll go and pick you up and so on. So you will create new incentives for people to make that choice. But here's my point to you, Joshua. Imagine instead of a world where you've got, say, 15% of the population without cars, and a transit systems that are focused on serving primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the transit-dependent population. to a point where maybe 80% of the people don't have cars, and all of the people have cell phones that can click on the app. You start to realize that you're not going to be dealing with two populations anymore. You're now going to be dealing with that same multiple range of services provided by third parties can meet the needs not only of, people that now drive cars, but also people who now don't drive cars. I think the emergence of autonomous vehicles, together with the emergence of third-party providers on a much grander scale than we have now, will completely change the way travel happens, urban travel happens in the future, and may well address both your question, Justin, about how do we get more people to carpool, Uber users, and your question, Joshua, about how can autonomous vehicles really change. I think it is 25 years out, maybe 20 years out, but I know that wasn't a question, and unfortunately I took too much time to give my point of view, but it did stir something in me when I heard those two presentations, because they're both legitimate points right now, but they're both going to answer themselves 25 years from now. Thanks.
Okay, responses?
Well, I would just make the comment. I really liked Justin's slide on the public policy things we should be doing to accommodate autonomous vehicles, and I would argue that those are all things we should be doing anyway, right? We're talking about we have too much parking, we don't charge enough for it, we don't charge enough for road spaces, and we don't have enough dedicated lanes for HOV and buses. Those things we have to do anyway. The mobility problem in Los Angeles is intractable without doing those things. We have traffic congestion that is beyond anything that can be reconciled by getting a few more people to ride transit or a few more people in pooled vehicles, frankly. The only way that we're going to solve the mobility challenge is by doing those exact public policy initiatives with or without true autonomous vehicles.
And I just add one other thing, which I think you're right, that the challenges that we're facing in the sort of early dawn of this new time looks very different than 10, 15 years from now for a couple of reasons. One is there's obviously a huge time lag for people. Once they've bought a car, a fixed asset, they have it, it sits there, and their decision is really about, well, do I want to use this asset or do I want to use some alternative means? And the most expensive part about buying a car is the fixed cost, not the variable ones. As consumers get more comfortable with the idea that they don't need a car, I think we'll see bigger shifts in the coming years when more people will decide, I won't buy this in the first place. So I think that'll be a big piece. And the other, which we talked about, you mentioned as well, is I think right now rideshare, globally is like 1%. Some very small number. So even as we just start to imagine it get to 5, 10%, the density that we'll have on our networks, I think, will dramatically increase and make products like Pool much more in high demand.
We're going to get others in.
The one thing I want to add...
Wait. Let's get others in before. I just want to make sure that other people get a chance. Are there other people who have comments? Right now?
Could I add something to that, Brian?
Okay, then you can jump in. Go ahead. Yeah.
Beijing is a real interesting example of the sort of situation you're talking about. Beijing, of course, has been investing very heavily in fixed rail, underground public transportation. They also have a lottery system for new vehicles in which you have to demonstrate you not only have a vehicle and you have a driver's license, but you have a parking spot for your new vehicle. The third thing that's interesting about Beijing, in addition to its extreme congestion, is that BB, the Chinese equivalent of Uber, offers something like 8 different options for travel, ranging from bikes all the way up to shared vans and different levels of luxury and that type of thing. And so you can see responses that would exist over a whole multimodal range in the future.
Okay, go ahead.
The thing I wanted to add, and I'll definitely stop here, in response to you, Justin, though, is there's one other thing, and I know Uber's already doing this, but when the scale changes from, 1,000 trip demand in a peak hour to 10 million trip demand in peak hour, what you get is you know where the person is and where the person's going. And when you've got 1 million people doing that at the same time, you now will have the intelligence to be able to pair those people up a lot easier. When people talk about carpooling themselves, they've got to try to find somebody going to the same place and that type of thing. Whereas kind of the AI part of this, where you would basically have huge amounts of data, knowing where people are going at any point in time, is another thing. And I think that you're right, Joshua, that doesn't depend on autonomous vehicles, okay, but it's part of the issue, because the movement toward autonomous vehicles coupled with the movement toward third-party mobility services with the knowledge of the additional data really can help shape a lot of solutions. Thanks.
Comment or reaction? Okay, we have another one here. Yes, go ahead.
Just one more question for Justin. Has Uber, because you talk about ride sharing and trying to increase the ridership. I guess for me, being more of an introvert, one of the reasons why I would never do that is I wouldn't want to sit next to a complete stranger. I think who will talk to me, right? Because I have no interest in talking to someone else that I don't know. Has Uber or has any companies looked into like creating a different type of vehicle that essentially has a private space? So essentially you have like 4 private compartments, kind of like a limo. You can put up your private screen or take it down at your option.
So I have heard similar concerns raised by others, and I have talked to some people on these circuits who have proposed similar things. I'm sure there is some startup somewhere who's going to disrupt the privacy bubble car moving machine industry, because somebody's always disrupting something somewhere. I don't think Uber is focused on that. Okay. I think we're tackling just getting sort of more mature vehicles to market super safely and on the road. I do know that there are other startups thinking about completely redesigning a vehicle for the AV world, so Zoox, Neo, among others. I don't know if I've heard of any tackling that specific one, but I'm sure there are, and my fellow panelists may have other thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add that that's terrifying as someone who works in public transit. I moved to LA 2 years ago from living in the Northeast for the first 40 years of my life, and one of the main differences I've noticed is that in Los Angeles, people are way more isolated from each other, in part because they don't walk on the street and they don't take mass transit in nearly as high numbers. And I don't think that's a positive for society. Interaction with other human beings is actually really a critical function of cities and urban space and mass transit. And it's sad that it's gone away to the extent that it has. I would hate to see it extend into shared vehicles that are smaller, too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other comments?
Yeah, I really like the idea of shared mobility, and I can really see that you know, looking at the future of people giving up their automobiles. But the thing that's in the back of my mind is I live in a state where, you know, maybe once or twice a year you have to evacuate where you live. And in a shared world, there are fewer vehicles available. How do you accomplish an evacuation of 7 million people in a shared world? So my plan is I may go down to 1 car so that I can still get out if I need to, get back when I want to, but that I share for many of my trips. What are your thoughts about evacuation in a shared world?
So, in short, I think there are probably a bunch of long-tail events that we worry about when we give up ownership. And, you know, I think I mentioned earlier about just this concept of reliability and why even now many people wouldn't, you know, want to give up their cars because, you know, they might just want to rely on something and have to not worry about it at all. And I think it's a totally fair and valid question. I think this highlights, and a little bit about the stool, all of these things sort of move together, which is if we really want to move people away from feeling they need to own a thing, they need to trust that there are other alternatives out there in time of need. And I think that's true about evacuations and probably a whole other host of things if we all wrote down what are the 2 things we're most worried about. Side note, that'd be a great survey focus group, so if all of you could stay here after, that'd be great. Those kidding, you can go get coffee. But I imagine this is where, you know, policies around like making sure we have large buses and good evacuation responses would need to be incorporated, and why I think this dialogue about the public sector mass transit operators who know how to move masses of people very well. Integrating with and collaborating with more micro-transit type products are important because I don't think there are clear solutions for that. I think one thing that we did do after, I think, the floods in various disasters is we did move vehicles down from other areas, and I think rental car companies did that a lot too. So you might see a little bit more national coordination, particularly when we know some things are going to happen, but I defer to you on some of these topics too. And
Yeah, Chris?
Well, I can give you one lesson learned. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a hurricane that was aimed at Houston. And so an evacuation order came for Houston. And it turns out that the planners were very surprised because the occupancy of the vehicles trying to evacuate from Houston at the time was very low. And the reason is that all the people who owned 2-3 cars all wanted to get them out of Houston so they didn't get flooded. And so there's some real planning issues associated with shared ride versus trying to get your own vehicle out of danger.
Yeah, along those lines, we have a very poor system of evacuation. From what I can tell, if we think that we evacuate as everyone get in their personal vehicle, that does not work very well. We have highly inadequate mass transit systems between cities in this country. We relied way too much on interstate and on aviation, and so when it comes to mass movement of ground transportation, we're really behind. And it falls again into the same bucket of things we should be doing anyway that we're not doing a good job of, regardless of whether there's autonomous vehicles.
So I want to pick up on a couple of themes that have come up here and ask for some reactions. One is that we heard Justin and then Joshua make reference to various kind of policy interventions, and it strikes me that in this conference we're talking a lot about sort of the exciting technological changes that are occurring and what the potentials they are to transform the transportation system. And I'm struck to hear that our largely political inability to effectively manage road systems is sort of in the way of that. So we think, well, we can't manage the road systems politically because it's just too controversial, so maybe these technologies will help. And then we hear what would really help is if we could manage the road systems to enable these technologies to do a better job. And it brings me back to this question about how we wrap our hands around sort of systematically managing the system so that companies like Uber and others can use this scarce resource more effectively. That's one thought, and then I want to tie it to a second issue, and it really came up with the evacuation. That to me, Justin, some of the genius of Uber and Lyft's business model is the capacity to move large numbers of vehicles in and out of commercial use. That I don't know any other transportation provider that can, in real time, adjust its prices so as to dramatically increase the supply of vehicles it has. Airlines would love to be able to do that. Shipping companies would love to be able to do that. Transit agencies would love to be able to roll in a lot of buses during the peak period and get rid of them and let someone else be responsible at other times. And that sort of genius sort of runs up against the idea that these companies will then have big fleets, because the peaking problem is an enduring problem in transportation management. And I'm wondering, I would think the analogous model would be that we're going to anticipate lots of people are going to have autonomous vehicles, and we're going to talk them into essentially letting us use those autonomous vehicles in subscription service, and we can change what we pay autonomous vehicle owners to be able to use those vehicles to pull them in when demand is high and to push them out when demand is low. But if you start to own a fleet, aren't you back with traditional transportation providers, which is struggling with the fact that you don't have enough vehicles during the peak and you have way too many during the off-peak, and you have this big stranded capital investment that you're trying to figure out how to make better use of? So those two parts about managing the road system and managing your fleet seem to me to be very closely related. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
So I think as for the first part, which is about, does technology drive the change, or does policy needed, or sort of what is that interplay? So Josh has mentioned a couple of times we should already be doing this. And if no other reason, you might want to get excited about the AV world, because I think it's a forcing mechanism for us to look closely at some of the things we should already be doing, but may not be for a variety of reasons. And I think it's because we're going to be changing a paradigm shift for how we have to operate, because the system might reach a breaking point. Otherwise, you showed, what happens in a world where we have all these EVs and there's no gas tax. That will create a problem of sort of funding infrastructure. And I think there will be things that will sort of reach the breaking point where we will be forced to sort of rethink how we do a lot of these things. So I actually think the technology may help drive some of the policy conversations that we have not really grappled with in as much depth. And I think there's sort of like maybe it's a virtuous circle in this case. Or vicious, I'm not sure. But anyway, so I think AVs gives us a moment to really take a look at some of these things. And then I think for those policies will need to be implemented well for AVs to realize its full potential. I think on the second part, I do think you're right that one of the things that has plagued the taxi industry in particular is a way of regulating was just firm caps, and you have this certain supply, and it was capped below demand at peak hours, and so inevitably people were always looking for more. I think we're probably still trying to think about exactly what that would look like, but maybe there's an analogy to the power sector, where there's like base power that's provided by certain types of power, and then you layer on like renewables for sort of more peaky times. So it may be that the AV fleet is managing sort of base load, and then there is a whole bunch of people who continue to own cars, whether because they just like the hobby or because they like the hobby of driving, or because they want reliability at certain needs, and then we call them into service, just as we do now, to highlight some of the peakiness.
So my view on elected officials is that they generally don't they don't make difficult political decisions because of something that will happen in the future. They make difficult political decisions, if they ever do, based on something that's happening in the immediate present. And because I have a very different perception of the timeline for fully autonomous vehicles than you probably do, I don't see those coming online fast enough to satisfy the mobility challenge that I see today. And that even if AVs might drive us towards better public policy outcomes in mobility, we can't afford to wait for them. There are, in Los Angeles and most major metropolitan areas, tremendous mobility problems today that are not being adequately dealt with because of all the policy problems that you've identified. And we need to push as hard as we can to get them identified before AVs come, because I don't think they're going to be here soon enough. Where they are going to be here soon enough is in the safety realm. And in the safety realm, it's going to be public policy's role to push technology, not the other way around. That's what I think is interesting, is that the money to be made, that this is why we have government, right, is that there's the profit motive and then there's public policy goals. The money to be made is not really in enhanced safety features, because generally people don't want to pay for enhanced safety features. That's been historically accurate anyway. That's why airbags weren't in cars until we forced the automakers to put them in cars, because people don't want to pay for that. And so people might be interested in paying for fully automated vehicles. That is certainly possible. That sounds exciting. They can look at their phones for another 20 minutes a day. But they're not necessarily looking to pay for, this will reduce my chance of being a fatality, because as we know, everyone is an above average driver and thinks that they'll be able to keep themselves safe. So I would argue that there's a tremendously important role for government in pushing the autonomous features in vehicles as fast as we possibly can in order to save lives as quickly as possible.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank Chris from Carnegie Mellon, Justin from Uber, and Joshua from LA Metro for the stimulating conversation. And I'm Brian Taylor from the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and have been given an announcement to share with you before you leave. And it's written in red, so it looks like important. It said, there are cookies available from 3 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., and that make sure to tell everyone to reconvene back in this room at 3:30 p.m. for the general session. The cookies are not in here. The cookies are out there. Thank you very much.
That's the way we get by, so the way we get by. Oh, that's the way we get by, so the way we get by. We go out in stormy weather. We rarely practice discern. We make love to some weird sin. We seek out the taciturn. That's the way we get